Hello, and welcome back to Kickoff Coaching. I'm Morgan Schnabel, the founder of Schnabel Real Estate and co-founder of Abundance Real Estate. Today we are going to be talking still about listings, but we're going to be transferring kind of to the end of the listing, more on a happy note that we received offers. So in the prior weeks, we've talked about getting your listing presentation ready, how to prep for it, how to talk to the seller before the listing appointment, how to get a listing appointment. Then we talked about how to actually structure your listing appointment so that you're prepared and knowledgeable and really the expert in that neighborhood. So you know how to communicate what you're going to be doing for the seller and how to manage those expectations. So now your listing is live. We've got videos on how to put your listing into the MLS. And now you have started receiving offers, which is so exciting. So as we've talked about in the buyer section, it's really important to make sure that you're communicating with the agent on the other side. So when you're the listing agent, that's communication with the buyer agent. When you are the buyer agent, you absolutely, even more so, need to be communicating with the listing agent. And this is in any market. That's so important because each of you have clients that have specific needs and wants in the transaction. And until you know what those things are and what's important to each party, it's hard to come together, right? So this isn't via texting, via email. Make sure you're communicating on the phone and talking to the other agent. That is so important. As a listing agent, this is especially important because a lot of times that buyer might have questions that need to be answered in a way that makes them feel comfortable. People are nervous, right? You are managing some of the biggest transactions of people's lives. That means it's really important that you are overly communicating. So when you're having showings and people are coming in and looking at the home, follow up with those agents, give them a call. Obviously, we use a system called Showing Time, which means that the agents are scheduling through the Showing Time platform. So you know what agent's coming in. We use our central lockbox, so you know exactly when they came in and when they left. But even afterwards, when Showing Time sends them the email to ask them to rate the showing and how everything went, 75% of agents who showed the property, the buyer agents, don't fill it out. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call. You owe that to your seller to find out what every buyer is thinking when they walk into the home. There have been plenty of times where I learned something that I didn't know from a buyer agent, like there's water in the basement, or the cat is loose, or the home smelled really bad when we walked into it. Now I get to remind my seller, please don't cook bacon before the showings, right? So just things that until you know, you can't communicate to the seller. And again, this is something that may seem a little wonky to everybody who's been used to a market that's been really, really wild and there's been multiple showings and you can't keep up with them. It's still important to communicate with every single person who shows that house so that you can really build those relationships and be known as a great agent to work with and represent your seller's best interests. So very recently, we had a great listing and we received a pretty good offer, but there were a couple tweaks that we needed to make. Specifically, and I'll give you details because this helps you understand the why behind it, we received an offer with a home sale contingency. I know many of you have not even seen an offer with a home sale contingency, but it is out there, right? And it is, at the time, it was our only offer. So we knew that we were going to accept it because we really were confident in that other home selling. So what that meant is the buyer who wanted to buy this house, they wrote a great offer, right? Almost 30 grand over list price, but they had that home sale contingency. So what do? Well, luckily in the home sale contingency, they have to tell us what the home is. So we did a little research and we found out that it's a home that's probably going to sell pretty quickly. But we wanted to counter something. As you know, you can either accept, reject, or counter an offer. Now, rejecting, I highly don't recommend unless you are going with another offer, right? Even at that point, I always tell the buyer agent, hey, do you want to be countered into secondary position? Because it's always great to have a secondary offer in the event that something falls apart, right? Very, very commonly, we move to our secondary if something happens with the first one, and the seller is able to be a little more strong-willed if they know they have a secondary in position. So we ended up countering the offer and adding in what's called a bump clause, which allows us to accept secondary offers and bump the buyer if they don't remove their home sale contingency. Well, of course, that really scared the buyer because they are not able to be displaced and not have a home to buy once they sell their home. So we didn't hear back from the agent for almost a day when we sent that back. So you know what I did? Picked up the phone. As your coach, as your broker, I will commonly ask you, how's that offer going? How's that counter you sent out going? How's that listing going? And if you say something like, yeah, we're waiting on the agent to call me back, it's been a day, pick up the phone, ask questions, right? Because if you don't and you just let the buyer control the situation, very possibly, and what it sounds like was going to happen, that buyer was going to reject our counter. But I called the agent and I said, let's come together on this. What is their main concern? I found out what their main concerns were. And the buyer agent did another counter. So now we had a second counter, tightening up some of those terms that made everybody feel better. We made it a win-win. We accepted an offer and everything was great. Just communicate. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but at least you can say you did everything to try, right? Ask questions. Find out what the big fears are. Every objection, every time a buyer or seller says no, or I want to walk away, find out what the root fear is. There is always a fear at the bottom of it. And many times that fear is coming from somebody being in their ear about a horror story about this happening or this happening or this happening one time to someone I knew, right? We know how easy it is to get things in our ear and plug a little fear in, which then causes us to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or I heard somebody got hurt really badly by doing that. So ask questions and find out what that root fear is so that you can fix it and come to a solution that everyone feels comfortable with. So with that, I do want to talk about now what happens that you've got great offers on the table. We're going to talk about when you have multiple offers, when you have one offer, and then how to present that to the seller in a way that they understand. This is because the offer to purchase contract, just at the bare minimum with addendum A, is almost 14 pages. If it's a condo, it's even more. Never, ever, ever just receive an offer via email and just send it over to your client and say, let me know what you think. Talk about a disaster, right? That seller is not looking at the offer to purchase contract all day, every day, like we are used to doing. You know how to read the offer line by line because, well, you're in this class and you watch the videos and you ask questions. So make sure you are finding those key points in the offer to purchase. And we're going to talk about what those are right now. So with that, we're going to talk about what's really, really important. So what are those things? Well, the sale price, right? That's really important to talk about because we want to make sure that they know what the sale price is going to be. And I think it would help if I pulled up an offer to purchase. All right, so we've got an offer to purchase here. And if you do go in the Google Drive and you need access to the class notes, just let us know. In there, it's going to link, if you're in Wisconsin, the WB11 and GMAR Addendum A and where to find each of these items, okay? So first we want to look at the sale price. Well, we're going to find that right away. And we're just looking at an example offer on line 10, okay? So that's really important because we want to make sure that we know exactly what the purchase price is so we know where to begin. Now, purchase price is not everything, right? That's why we're doing a multiple offer comparison. So let's keep looking. All right, we're going to look at a blank one here. So that's going to be right on line 10 of the offer to purchase. So if we're looking at a multiple offer, offer one, we're going to put the sale price of what it is. How much earnest money are they putting down? That's really important to know because now we know how strong of an offer it is and how much the buyer is willing to lose if they skip town or walk away or breach the contract. So we can find the earnest money information on the second page of the offer. And again, if you're looking at a condo offer, it's a little bit different, but they're going to be in similar areas. So earnest money, we usually look at line 58. Sometimes earnest money is submitted with an offer, but many times earnest money is submitted after acceptance of the offer. So right here, that's how much earnest money is going to be put down. Very commonly, we are seeing 1%. So if the purchase price is $500,000, $5,000 is very common. If they're putting $30,000 as their earnest money, well, we know these buyers are serious, right? And that's common. A lot of people do that to make an offer look stronger because, well, they're spending the money anyway. Why not put it down right away? Keep in mind that the contract has contingencies typically that allow the buyer to get that earnest money back if something falls apart. Now, at the end of the day, only an attorney can advise if those things are allowed to happen or not, or what can be actually put through in the contract. But typically that's how that would work. So always consult an attorney if you have questions on, can a seller do that? Can a buyer do that? We know what the contract says, but as licensees, we are not allowed to actually make the contract happen, enforce the contract, or interpret the contract. Buyer closing costs. Is the buyer asking for closing costs to be in the offer to purchase? Are they asking the seller to cover any of their costs? That actually is going to typically be found in Addendum A, which we include very commonly. Now, different municipalities, different boards have different addenda. So just make sure that you become familiar with yours. We're looking at the Greater Milwaukee Association of Realtors addendum. So we're going to find that on line 10, seller contribution, okay? But keep in mind, that's not the only place it could be. It could also be thrown in the Addendum A additional provisions, right? Or it might be at the bottom of the offer to purchase in additional provisions here. So just make sure to check all of those places to make sure you don't miss anything. Nothing worse than having your seller accept something that they did not intend to. Closing date. When is this closing? That's really important to know. So that's going to be right away in the offer to purchase. Closing date is going to be on line 47. This transaction to be closed on blank. Sometimes you'll see on or before, or you'll see a date. The contract is written to take a date, so we're always going to be looking for an actual date. Typically 30 to 45 days is standard. If it's a 2-week closing, well, that also means the buyer is very excited and they're probably paying cash because sometimes financing takes a little bit longer than that. Inspection contingency. Are they having an inspection? That's important to note too. Keep in mind they can't have an inspection unless they actually have the contingency in the offer to purchase. So we're going to see the inspections and testing section. It's going to be line 193. That's going to be checked. Okay. Watch for line 197. You're going to commonly see entire property or entire premises. It's completely redundant. It does not need to be there. If it is, don't worry about it. The inspection already covers the entire property, so I'm not sure why agents put that there. Again, redundant. But specifically, they might have roof or foundation or chimney. What that means is that they intend on having a general inspection and they intend on having a specialist come in for that specific thing. If the chimney is clearly falling apart, if I were the buyer agent, I would also call out a chimney inspection so that I can just get a chimney specialist in right away. Otherwise, per the contract, the buyer has to wait until the inspector recommends it, which they're probably going to do if it's falling apart, but then it just takes extra time. So do let your seller know, hey, just so you know, they're able to have an inspection, and the contract actually says that the buyer is able to have, per line 200, follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they occur prior to the deadline on 206. Well, there's your deadline. How many days are they giving for inspection? That means all the inspections need to happen before that amount of days. So it defaults to 15. If for some reason a buyer agent left it blank, it's 15. As we know, we would never leave an offer to purchase area blank like that because we never want to let the contract just default. It looks messy and frankly, it just looks lazy. But if it was left blank, it's 15 for the contract. Does the seller have the right to cure? What that means is, does the seller have the ability to fix a defect if they were issued a notice of defects because of it? That's going to be right here. Line 216, shall or shall not have the right to cure. So look for that as well, okay? Testing contingency. Testing is different than an inspection because testing is actually taking a sample and evaluating it, when an inspection is looking at it right then and there. So where does testing go? Testing does not go here. It even says this contingency only authorizes inspections, not testing, okay? So where's testing? Typically it's going to be on Addendum A. So everything but the radon test. Radon test contingency is its own contingency. So what that is, it's when the inspector leaves a little box in the home, typically for 48 hours, to measure the air quality. They're usually going to leave that box in the basement to see if radon is present in the home. There's really no indicators that radon's there because it's completely odorless. It's something very commonly people want to have done. It's a pretty easy test to have. You can pop it right onto your normal inspection as a buyer. And they're looking for this 4.0 picocuries per liter reading. If it comes back higher, that means it failed. And typically the seller needs to have a radon mitigation system put in, or the buyer technically could use the contingency to get out of the offer if the seller did not allow it to be done, or if the buyer did not give the right to cure right here. So as a seller, you always want it to have the right to cure because it gives you a little more power. You're looking for shall or shall not. That's something as a listing agent that I commonly would counter to give my seller, the right to cure. Because without it, the buyer can just walk away without asking for things to be fixed first. So that's something as a seller that is really not in their best interest. And as we know, for the listing contract, we have a fiduciary responsibility to always work in the seller's best interest when we have that listing contract signed. So that's where testing would go. In addition, on GMAR Addendum A in the beginning, there's a whole bunch of tests here. So they do have a blank testing field. This is where the buyer agent would check that box and put a mold test, an asbestos test, something specific that they're looking for. You'll see many people will write any test recommended by home inspector. Technically, the testing contingency is supposed to be specific, but we do see that very commonly. What that means is that the seller is authorizing any test to happen if the inspector recommends it. Very similar to having those secondary inspections. Very similar. Then we've got well water test, and then a couple other inspection contingencies in regards to wells and septic systems. So the well water test commonly goes with the well system inspection. They're going to inspect the well, and they're going to test the water to make sure that it doesn't come back positive for things like radium or different things that they might put in there, pesticides, lead, copper. Very common, we see like high chlorine. There's different things that could be in there. We want to make sure that that's not the case. And then an actual septic inspection, the sanitary system. So if the home has a well or a septic, typically these items are covered by the seller, the actual test and inspection. So that's something we want to make sure that the seller knows back in the listing appointment when they check yes on the seller info sheet that they have these things, that they know that most likely they're going to be getting these items inspected. Okay. Financing. Is the buyer financing or not? Keep in mind that the buyer, whether they're financing or not, doesn't need to disclose that. So we'll talk a bit more about that. So on line 248, if this box is checked, that means the offer is contingent upon financing. It means the buyer is getting a mortgage and they're saying, if my mortgage falls through, if I lose my job, if I'm no longer approved for my mortgage, I have a right to get out of the contract. One thing you want to keep in mind is when you have a financing contingency, find out who the lender is. So very commonly, really, I wouldn't accept an offer without a pre-approval letter, because if they're making the offer contingent upon financing, we want to know who's doing the financing. So as a listing agent, I'm making sure that they're not using any like really big banks, because a lot of times that means there's really no personalized service, no one for us to get a hold of if we have questions, no one who really cares if it closes on time or not. So I like to look for a local mortgage lender who I've heard of in our market to make sure that we have access to them if we need to talk to them or if something happens. So we're always looking for that. If they waive the financing contingency and the buyer doesn't have this, that doesn't mean they're not financing. And as a seller, make sure to let them know up front that they still are able to finance if they want to. If they waive the financing contingency, it actually says that if the offer is not contingent on financing, then there's a requirement for a proof of funds or something else. So this is something the buyer agent would fill out if the buyer wasn't using the financing contingency. It actually says as well, buyer understands and agrees that this offer is not subject to the appraisal meeting any particular value unless this offer is subject to an appraisal contingency, nor does right of access for an appraisal constitute a financing commitment contingency, because above it says seller agrees to allow buyer's appraiser access to the property for purposes of an appraisal. So right there, the buyer is still able to have an appraisal done and finance the property, even if it's not contingent upon financing or the appraisal itself. So an appraisal contingency, same thing here. If the buyer waives it, it doesn't mean they're not going to have an appraisal. Again, reread these lines 302 to 307 if you need clarification on that. The answer is always in the contract. but it means the buyer, even if it appraises too low or too high or whatever, they're still going to buy it. Okay, so remember, buyer understands and agrees that this offer is not subject to the appraisal meeting any particular value unless they have the contingency. So if box 308 is checked, now they're making the offer contingent upon the appraisal meeting the value of the offer to purchase. Again, we'll use that 500 number. If the appraisal contingency is in there and the offer to purchase price is 500,000 and the appraisal comes back at 480, well, now technically with the appraisal contingency, if it's before this deadline that they're going to put here, 30 days is common, 28, 40, it just depends on the lender that they're using. If the appraisal does not meet the value, the buyer has a right to walk away if that appraisal doesn't meet the value. And a lot of times as a seller, we go back and forth and we negotiate. Maybe the seller goes down by 10,000 and buyer brings the extra 10,000 to closing, and we talk about what that looks like. The conversation I'll have with a seller sometimes, if it's very, very close, is, are we really willing to go back to the market and hope that the next buyer doesn't have an appraisal? And if they do, hope that it comes back higher than this one did. So those are conversations we have. But keep in mind, just that financing and appraisal contingency, if they're not in there, it doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means the offer is not contingent upon those things happening. So I know that can get kind of confusing as a buyer agent and as a listing agent. It's just something that you want to pay attention to if they're doing those things. So we talk through financing contingency, the financing type. Is it conventional? Is it VA? Is it FHA? Is it WIDA loan? Is it, what is the loan type? Conventional is kind of the best loan that we're looking for, as far as if it's a conventional loan, those are harder to get approved for. So we look at those as like kind of the best loan type. Are they getting an ARM, an adjustable rate mortgage? That's really common too as rates are rising. So just keep an eye out for what that is, and don't be afraid to give the lender a call, because you do have a pre-approval with the lender's information on it, and ask them, hey, how does this buyer look? Honestly, a good lender should be calling you as a listing agent anyway to talk up their buyer and make their offer stronger. Doesn't always happen though. So feel free to ask questions. They're not going to be able to give you the buyer's credit score or anything like that, or confidential info, but you can at least get a good feel for who the lender is, if they're going to close on time, and if the buyer is well qualified. If the buyer is waiving the appraisal contingency as well, I also like to talk about a proof of funds for an appraisal gap. You can waive the appraisal contingency all day long, but if you don't have the money, then what good is it? So I do like to talk to the lender sometimes too and say, hey, just so you know, they waived the appraisal contingency, but they are financing. Do they have the cash to be able to do that? So don't be afraid to vet the buyer, right? That's half of your value add to the sellers, is that you're only bringing them offers that are well vetted and qualified. If they went for sale by owner, there's no one doing something like that. You're vetting every buyer to make sure when you accept an offer, you did everything you could to make sure that that offer is going to close. Is there an accelerator addendum? An accelerator addendum would be attached to the offer on line 573. Always pay attention to this line, 573, the addenda attached, because this shows you what documents they attached to the offer. That means they're now a part of the offer. You can see addendum A, right? This commonly attached addendum. Addendum O for occupancy, addendum R if it's rental, and the accelerator addendum could be included as well. And there's so many others. Those are the most common, I would say, that we see very often. And the accelerator addendum basically says, I'm offering 500, but I'm willing to pay $5,000 over the next highest offer up to 600. So that if an offer came through at 550, this buyer just became 555. Pay attention, an accelerator is there as well. Normally the buyer agent will tell you, hey, we submitted a great offer in their offer summary email to you, it should have that, but let's say it doesn't. Well, now it's up to you to look for it, right? So you're making sure that all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So if there's an accelerator in there, you obviously will catch it when you look at line 573. What is the price after the accelerator? Or what is the highest price they're willing to go to? It gets real fun when you have 7 offers on the table and 5 accelerators, right? It can kind of be like, okay, this offer makes this one become this and this one becomes this. Some accelerators are enacted by the max of another. Some are only if it's in the offer to purchase. So those can get real tricky. But don't worry, if you're in the class, or at our firm, you will be definitely talked through what that looks like. Additional inclusions. Pay attention to inclusions. Don't be the listing agent who accidentally sells grandma's piano, okay? So what that means, take a look on line 13 of the offer and make sure you know what's included and what they write in. We recently had an offer to purchase where they wrote in the seller's beloved custom-made dining room table. Everything was great on the offer except that we had to counter the offer, which means we had to open it back up, send a counter over and change that one little term because the seller literally said, I am not willing to sell the house with that dining room table. That's what the seller wanted though, and they knew the risks of opening the transaction back up and allowing the buyer possibly to walk away, right? We never want to open it back up if we don't have to, but they did. So pay attention to inclusions, okay? Pay attention to exclusions. If the seller has a hot tub on the property and they don't want to move it, and in exclusions, the buyer writes hot tub, the seller's moving that hot tub. So pay attention to that, have the conversation, okay? Don't expect a seller to read through this contract and catch things, right? They're gonna say, well, I just signed what you told me to. So it's your job to look through. And that's also kind of what this spreadsheet helps you do, because it really allows you to kind of remember all the things you need to look for. And then we look at proceeds, right? The reason we do this, we're kind of doing a mini seller net proceeds while we're comparing the offers, because sometimes the sale price could be 500, 510, and 520, but maybe this one actually nets us the most money. Or maybe this one waives financing and appraisal, and we don't think it's going to appraise out at that 510 price. So sometimes it's better to take a lower offer if it doesn't have the appraisal contingency, because it means this is 510 no matter what. This is 520, and we think it's going to appraise around 500, right? Because we looked at comps and we kind of know this buyer is kind of overpaying. We're more comfortable here. Or you could then multiple counter or counter this buyer and say, okay, well, we need a $20,000 appraisal gap, meaning if it appraises low, you're willing to go $20,000 over that asking price. So those are things that we talk about and negotiate through. But these are really the key points, right? We're also looking, does it have a home sale contingency? That's really important to note as well, right? So we kind of looked at some of these main items, but line 328, is there a home sale contingency? That's really important to know too, because you don't want to accidentally accept an offer with a home sale contingency. If you already have a primary accepted offer and you receive a secondary offer, you need to make sure box 348 is checked. Because if you accept another offer without that box checked, you may have just sold the home to two people. And I've seen it happen. It's not pretty. It pretty much only ends in a lawsuit and someone paying somebody out. So that's something you always want to make sure of. There's so much good information of this offer to purchase, and we do have an entire class going over the offer to purchase. No matter if you're on the buying or selling side, you've got to know this contract in and out, because as a listing agent, you really need to be able to know what you're communicating to the seller as far as what is in the offer. So then we also look at, okay, we look at the sale price again, we look at the commission rate, right? Now we're kind of looking at net proceeds before mortgage payoff. We look at the owner's title insurance policy. I always put a general number in, but you can feel free to check with your title company and see what the average title cost is going to be. I use 1,200 as a general number if the home's like in the 350 range. If the home's like 500-600, I might use 1,800. If it's more, I might use 2,000. Just general, but again, check with your title company, because every state, every area is different. Wisconsin real estate transfer tax, that's easy. It's always $3 per thousand. So whatever amount you put in here, if you're using this spreadsheet, you actually can just put a number in here and then it will calculate for you. Settlement and miscellaneous closing fees, I always throw a number in there like 1,200 or so, just for unforeseen little fees that might come through. I always try to underestimate what they're going to get, because I want them to be pleasantly surprised at closing and not be already spending money that isn't there, and have them be disappointed. If the buyer had closing costs, we put that down here in their proceeds. Is there a home warranty, and how much is it? So that the home warranty we're going to find here on line 13 of addendum A. Does the buyer want a home warranty? Who's ordering it? The listing or selling agent. Listing agent is you, selling agent is the buyer agent. If it's you, you need to make sure to have your transaction coordinator do that, or if you're doing your own transactions, you need to make sure to do that. We do have a video on how to order home warranties. And what's the max? So whatever that max is, I like to put right here and just assume it's coming off the closing statement. And then estimated total cost of everything, and then gross proceeds prior to mortgage payoff. If it's my seller and I have a listing contract, I typically know what their mortgage payoff is. So I'll throw that in here as well, just so they know what their actual check is going to be, because I always tell them your mortgage holder gets paid first. That's number one. The money is yours after that mortgage gets paid off. Okay. Once you accept, reject, or counter an offer, then you want to make sure that you are giving them a seller net proceed, which we're going to do. I just want to quick go over a counter offer and what that looks like. So if the seller decides that they want to counter the offer, you are going to be focusing on this line, not this line. So you're actually going to be countering the offer down here. They're going to initial as countered, but then make sure to initial or sign all of the other documents that came with. Really important as well when you're organizing your documents to keep the offer on top, then addendum A, then any other documents that went with, like the signed condition report, addendum S for lead paint, and keep the documents traveling together. Meaning if you end up countering the offer, the first page, you want to now be counter one, okay? And you're gonna if you're in .loop or a transaction management software, make sure the counter is on top, then the offer. And I always do the newest counter first. So it goes counter 4, 3, 2, 1, if you end up having that many counters. Keep everything clean and together, okay? That's really, really important. I'll see if we've got our counter offer here. All right, so we've got a counter offer here. So with that, this is kind of the way you're going to organize everything if you want to keep everything really, really clean. Your counter is going to go on top of your PDF, then your offer to purchase, okay? And if you'll notice, this is an actual countered offer. We've got the seller's initials down here, okay? Then we've got the seller initialed addendum A. There was an addendum O in here as well. Seller's initialed that. There was an accelerator. This is a good one. It's got a good example of everything. The seller normally would sign right here. The addendum S, and the buyer signed that. And we kind of go through, okay, we've got the condition report, and then that's really everything that you would have in an offer to purchase, plus a proof of funds, a pre-approval, maybe a letter, depends on what the transaction is. But this is kind of a good example of how you'd structure your PDF. So since the seller countered, we've got counter one by the seller, right? You always want to make sure to number your counters. I've seen as many as 17 counters before. Honestly, I always think, man, I feel like a good conversation between two agents could have prevented so many counters, but sometimes the buyer and seller just cannot come to terms. Keep in mind, counter 2, counter 3, counter 4, you need to re-add everything you're countering in every single counter for it to be valid. What I mean by that is if you have 5 counters, basically the contract becomes what's on counter 5 and what's in the actual offer to purchase. Counter 1, 2, 3, and 4 no longer have any applicable information. Meaning if you're changing the price and then going back and forth on some other terms, that price change needs to be in every single counter, okay? Again, just ask if you have questions on that. But at this one, we excluded the kitchen table from line 13. Line 13 right here, we took that kitchen table right out. Line 551, we wanted to let everyone know and disclose that the seller was related to the listing agent because we have to disclose that. And then we added we said on line 41 of addendum A, if you want to know what that is, I think there was a well inspection. Line 41, shall or shall not, the buyer agent wrote shall not have the right to cure for the well water testing contingency. What that means is that if it came back high on something, that the seller did not have the right to fix the defect. We want the right to cure that defect, okay? And then we have a deadline on the counter. We don't really attach anything. You don't need to attach the original offer because it's already implied that it's a part of it, right? It's counter 1 of that offer. We have the date, we have the name, so that's implied there. Then we've got who drafted it, the date, the seller signed, and now we hope that the buyer signs. So that's kind of how we would do a counter. A multiple counter means that you can counter multiple different buyers at the same time on terms. But not only does it have to be accepted by the buyer, it needs to be accepted again by the seller, because obviously you can't have 2 people you can't accept 2 offers, right? So you use the multiple counter when you're countering multiple people. The counter offer means if you've got a counter offer out there with a buyer, the second it gets accepted and delivered back to you, you've got an accepted offer. So you can never, ever, ever send a counter offer to two different buyers. You'd have to use the contract called the multiple counter offer. It looks just like this. It's got an acceptance area, but then once the seller gets it back accepted from the buyer, even if they get all three back accepted, the one that the seller then signs on the third line, that's now the accepted offer once it's delivered back to the buyer agent. So a good question too, and have we done this? Can you use a multiple counter offer with just one buyer? Yes, you can. And why would you do that? You do that if you want to keep time open because you think another offer might be coming in. If you use the counter offer, the second that buyer accepts it, you're under contract once it's delivered back to you. With a multiple counter, the buyer accepts it, but then it has to come back to the seller and it gives them a little more time to accept it. And if a better offer comes in the meantime, they can accept it, especially if you know that one's coming, but your current offer that you have is about to expire, you can multiple counter it to basically open some time back up and buy yourself some time. I've definitely done it as long as you disclose to the agent that you're working with that they're the only one you're negotiating with so that you're not implying you have more offers than you really do, you're totally fine. So that's something that is very commonly done to kind of, buy yourself some more time if you think something's coming. So with that, I want to look at the seller net proceeds and then we'll wrap this up. So seller net proceeds, you're basically taking the same terms from before. Once you now accept an offer, you're taking all of the fees and everything that the seller is paying and telling them what at the end of the day they're going to be paying for. So this especially is important if you covered staging or you're doing a luxury listing with them. At our firm, you have the ability to use firm money to do some capital improvements on the property to make your listing more desirable and maybe fix some things. Maybe the seller is investing $10,000 into capital improvements that you know are going to net them $50,000. And we'll of course teach you how that works. But that's really helpful too. This seller in particular had a $38,000 capital improvement, but it got them over $50,000 more in this specific case. And that includes staging as well. So we commonly will front those items so that it just comes off the seller's net proceeds so that they don't need to cut a check, because a lot of sellers don't want to do that, but it's a little easier for them if they can just take it off their proceeds and then the firm or agent gets reimbursed at that time. We do that very often. We've got commission. Okay, we've got the luxury listing expenses, the title insurance policy, the transfer tax, settlement and closing fee estimate, buyer closing costs. In this case, we didn't have any, and then what the seller is netting. This is really important, and you want to make sure that you are getting them a net proceeds on every single transaction, because that's what you're here for. You're here to tell them how much money they're going to make and help them do it. So with that, we went over the multiple offer comparison, how to use a counter, how to use a multiple counter, how to read the offer to purchase, and then how to do a seller net proceeds. Okay. A lot of times seller net proceeds is kind of daunting. Don't worry, it's not. We can always help you with that as well. And if you do take a look at the notes from class, you will find specifically where to find every single big contingency that you want to go over with your seller. I hope this was really helpful to you. Have a great day and let us know if you have any questions.